Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Carolina.
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on reality, and I want to hit a few points with this episode talking about our perception of reality and the philosophy of it, and a little bit about, I guess, the neuroscience. These are all topics that we've spoken about before, but I kind of wanted to have a unifying episode. And even though I wanted it to be a unifying episode, I feel like I'm gonna diverge into other topics as well.
Which is fair enough, given it's basically the largest topic you could possibly choose.
Yeah. Um, so I guess I'll start off with a quote by Chris Frith, where he says that perception is a result of fantasies coinciding with reality. And for me, this is really interesting, and it relates a bit to our episode on color about whether it is us perceiving the outside world and reality, or whether it's more like a hallucination, or if it's both and they somehow meet in the middle.
Yeah, like when we talk about reality, are we talking about an objective reality that exists without perception, or are we talking about a perceptual reality that only exists with humans? Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it's really cool. And so I read another quote and how it talks about that there's this debate between realism and idealism, and that these are seen as separate things, and that perceptions are quote unquote veridical hallucinations, and that whether it is states of the subject projected outside oneself or that these states do constitute the reality. Yeah, and they also talk about, I guess, perception and recollection and how we see these things as separate. But I guess there's no real way to differentiate between the two.
Okay.
And this I think relates a little bit to what we're talking about in terms of like,
Memory.
yeah, or schizophrenia, and that can we differentiate whether the stimuli is coming from outside or within?
Yeah. I was relating that to like our episode on is memory consciousness or is memory reality, I guess is another way to say it.
Yeah.
Because if we're talking about the relationship between perception and recollection, then I guess that we're talking about the relationship between, like you said, the inputs that, well, neuroscientifically, the inputs we receive from our sensory environments, and then how we enforce memories or contextual information on that information.
Yeah, but for that, in the first place, we would need to accept that there is an external reality,
Yeah.
and that there is an interaction between the external reality and our brain matter, as opposed to it all just being a hallucination.
Yeah, like the coincidence between them intuitively makes more sense than one
Yeah.
or the other alone.
Yeah. So this actually brings me to ideology, and I know that ideology is often associated with things such as like Marxism or capitalism or liberalism, but Slavoj Zizek and Lacan both see ideology more as a representation of how we interact with the world through language. So then this ties in a bit like philosophy of language as well, in that we see the world through the ideology that we subscribe to.
Being our language.
Yeah, being our language or whatever like social constructs we have. And this is a really silly example, but Slavoj Zizek gives this like joke about a guy goes into a restaurant and he orders a cup of coffee without milk. And then the waiter comes back and he's like, "Sorry, sir, we only have coffee without cream. Is that okay?" And then obviously the subject is the same, coffee,
Yeah.
but it's the different ideologies that can lead you to have a different perspective on what it is.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Okay, but how is that ideology?
I think the point that they're making is that ideology affects our perception of the world. And
So in
so,
that case, would it be like whether or not you're viewing coffee as the subject or whether or not you're viewing milk as the subject, right?
yeah, it's like as if capitalism was cream and communism was milk, but we are coffee.
I was just saying that, so in this case, ideology would be the idea of whether or not you view what you view as the subject, what you idealize as the subject.
Yeah, I think in this case, the ideology is the cream or the milk. And depending on which one you subscribe to, you see it differently.
I thought that the ideology would be the coffee or the thing accompanying the coffee. So if you're focusing on the coffee, then both would be synonymous, without milk, without cream.
Yeah.
But if you're focusing on the accompaniment to the coffee, then you're focusing on milk and cream, both.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then you would think that it would be significant whether or not the coffee comes with milk or cream.
Yeah. Yeah, so
So that's actually really significant because we are obviously constrained to being human, and our ideology is therefore constrained to a human one to start with. Yeah, so which is why, of course, humans anthropomorphize everything and we see through our human eyes human means. So,
Yeah.
like, for example, we always see coffee as the subject,
yeah.
but a plant or another animal may see not coffee as the subject, and then your
Yeah.
whole reality would be different.
Yeah. And so for Zizek, he suggests that ideology is a subconscious phenomenon that helps shape the world that we live in. And then also, according to Lacan, we don't interact with the world as it is, but as we represent it through language. So,
Yeah.
so this is another silly example, but it was through a conversation I had with someone. Before I go into that, Lacan thinks of ideology in reality in three different concepts: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And so, like, the imaginary, I guess, is our imagination, and then the symbolic is the meaning that we derive out of the reality, and then the reality instinctively feels like the external world. But then the issue is, are we interacting with the reality or are we creating it? And like, according to Zizek and Lacan, the perception that they have on ideology, we are creating it. So if I were to say, that's a chair and that's a table, we understand the meaning of those two words separately and we like associate those objects separately. If I were to define a chair and a table as quadratica, some new word, I'm defining that. And now whenever I say quadratica, you see a chair and a table together.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is that we do that with everything. And so with everything, it's a creation. We are creating it, and those things may not actually exist. We're just assigning it words and meaning.
So I definitely agree with that. But at the same time, you can still view language as purely a means to categorize, as you've just described, which will shape your reality, but it still won't shape your experiential reality completely.
Why not?
You know, like, so maybe if you started to see all furniture as one type of thing called furniture, but you had no names for any of the like subcategories, then like how much would your reality actually be shaped? Because you would still use a chair as a chair and a table as a table and a bed as a bed. And you would still see that they have different forms. You just wouldn't categorize it in your mind as different. So then your communication about furniture with other beings would be different, but your experience of them wouldn't be significantly different.
Yeah, and I agree with that intuitively, but I heard someone else's argument, and even though I don't intuitively agree with it, I found it to be an interesting one where it's like, no, you wouldn't simply have the same experience and interact with these objects in the same way. It's more like every time you name something or define something, you are kind of like sketching it out of reality and it becomes your reality. Like, the only reason we differentiate between air and water is because we have separated them.
But if you go beyond categorization again, would your experience of being standing on land and swimming in the sea be different? Would you not feel the difference of the water versus the air, you know?
Yeah.
And surely this actually also could inform us about what reality is based on what we have come up with through language. Like the fact that we have different words for air and water, it gives support for the fact that they are two separate entities.
But we don't do that with everything. Like, for example, we've had this example with the Russian blues
Yeah, I was
on the
thinking about
color
that as well.
episode.
But I think color is a bit different. Yeah. Like, I think color makes us realize that reality is not as ground truth as it may be. But, like, with certain other things, like the fact that we could actually use our language systems, what I'm coming to realize through this conversation, so we could actually use our language systems to kind of define what is more objective,
Oh, yeah.
based on seeing what different languages across the world share in common, like what sort of categories are shared. And then the ones that aren't, like color, there are a lot of different names for different colors, and it's always different based on the language. Then those maybe are less objective realities.
But isn't that a flaw that we're using our own language to come up with a measure of what is subjective versus objective? Like
When our language is subjective.
yeah.
Yes, but we don't have much else because
Yeah.
like we are ultimately restricted from our human perspective. So we only have that to compare with. you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, definitely. Which is why I guess we believe that we perceive reality when it may not be reality.
But I think that the argument for language shaping our reality doesn't address whether or not there is a surface of reality that we exist on.
But I think it affects our perception. It's
Like, I think it affects our perception, but I don't think it affects whether or not reality exists. It affects our perception of a reality that we can assume exists. So, like the example with the chair and the table, like that doesn't solve the problem, or whether or not both chairs and tables are actually a hallucination.
yeah.
It only solves the problem of what we view a chair as and what we view a table as, assuming that they both already exist on the same plane as us.
Yeah, I definitely do see what you're saying. But I also feel like, our brains filter out specific information. Like if it's repeated information, we may no longer register it. And I think that's similar with this kind of thing in that we chose to pay attention to that. And we chose to define that as like furniture, whether it's a chair and a table together or separate is a different thing. But I think it's because we did pay attention to that and focus our attention to that. But perhaps there's aspects of reality that we just haven't paid attention to and
Yeah.
therefore haven't defined it.
That I agree with. But again, I still feel like this doesn't address the larger question of how real is reality.
Well, it could all be solipsistic. So, like Descartes, I only know I am a thinking thing, and that's the extent of what we can know. Like, and just throw empiricism away.
Yeah.
And there's this other school of philosophy called structuralism, which is a mode of knowledge of focusing on relationships rather than individual objects. It's more defined by the set of relationships that objects have as opposed to the qualities that they possess. So again, like our interaction with what one may call reality, or just like our interaction with each other. So for example, color, like, it has the properties and the wavelengths, but it's more about the fact that we have the phenomenological experience of the color as opposed to the properties.
Yeah.
So it's our relationship.
Yeah. I have something to add to that.
Yeah.
Because I went recently to an art exhibit at the Tate with Hilma Klint and Piet Mondrian. And there was a part of the exhibition that showed some of Goethe's, a German poet and philosopher, some of his writing. And it reminded me of the philosophy of color episode that we did. It spoke about Goethe's theory of color, which was highly controversial. But he basically said that color is a degree of darkness, And by that, he indicated that darkness is something that exists on its own. So, kind of like darkness is the objective reality. And then light is merely a means to see color through our eyes in its different manifestations. So color is a manifestation of light that exists on a objective plane of darkness.
That's so cool. I like
Yeah.
that perspective.
And the reason that it was so controversial is because it's much more phenomenological than like materialistic, because it suggests that darkness exists whether or not we perceive it or not. Well,
No,
it suggests that there's a world of phenomena that exists whether or not we perceive it.
Yeah.
So the color will still exist as long as there is light on darkness, whether or not we perceive it. Which contrasts to like the bulk of what people would believe, that color is merely a perception.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, that kind of reminds me of structuralism because it's about the relationship.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Going back to whether reality is a controlled hallucination, this ties into what we've spoken a lot about predictive coding, and schizophrenia and autism are interesting models to look at it because, as mentioned before, with autism, it's because there's a high degree of bottom-up inputs and weak top-down. And with schizophrenia, it's the opposite. There's strong top-down and weak bottom-up. And
Well, that's the theory at least.
yeah, the
Or
theory,
the hypothesis.
the
yeah.
hypothesis of like the model. And it would be interesting to know to an extreme if you just have top-down inputs and it becomes like an echo chamber. Yeah, whether or not that is just what is happening. And we have no sensory information. It's all just top-down. Yeah.
Kind of related is like the idea of a sensory deprivation tank where you're like submerged in water, I think, or some sort of liquid where you float and you don't have any sound, you don't have any vision, and you're just left there with your thoughts. I spoke about it in a previous episode, I can't remember which one. But I guess that's kind of the closest we could get to understanding what a bottomless experience, purely top-down experience is.
Yeah.
And in that case, though, because you've already lived a life full of bottom-up experiences, like sensory experiences, then you're left with memories and thoughts of those experiences. So still not completely regarding that question. But if you were left long enough in there, maybe you would start hallucinating.
Yeah, I think that's most likely. But is it hallucination?
Like solitary confinement.
Or is it the barrier of perception and recollection at point gets blurred?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of sleep. Because in sleep, when you're dreaming, your recollection through the form of dreams is your perception of reality. Like you are convinced in the moment that that is reality.
And it's also interesting how you need a certain degree of recollection in order to then be able to perceive reality, and vice versa, and how the recollection causes you to have an internal model of the world, a representation of the world.
Yeah, like you still see it in the same way. You still like see colors and hear sounds and see people and faces how you do in waking world.
Yeah. It's interesting to know how it's such a fine balance between having that recollection and having that updated model, and how easily it can go into one end of like schizophrenia or autism or any other type of altered plane of reality. And that actually reminds me of the book Doors to Perception by Aldous Huxley. It's really interesting the way that he records his experiences on mescaline. And there's this part in which he talks about how humans have this urge to escape, quote, the longing to transcend themselves, if only for a few moments, is and has always been one of the principal appetites of the soul. It's interesting, this feeling of wanting to transcend. And I guess, does it speak to the fact that perhaps we are trapped in some sort of bubble, or like we're in a dream, and right now we're in the recollective part of the process, and constantly through escapism trying to break out into this other plane of reality?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea with regards to psychedelics, because psychedelic experiences basically offer a new form of reality. Whether or not that form is transcendental is individual belief basis.
But I guess then it's which one is the real reality?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Which
we
kind of speaks to the point I was trying to make about the chair but failing.
in what sense?
And that, like, this is a perfect example that, yeah, we could all try and agree that that's a chair and we, etc. But as soon as we enter into any other plane of reality, it doesn't even have to be psychedelics. It can just be dreams where things have no laws. You know, what is reality? Which one is it?
Yeah.
Is it created or is it perceived?
Or is perception creation?
Interesting.
Which I would say, yeah. Well, yeah, which I kind of...
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Perception is more like...
I think this kind of relates to is maths discovered or invented?
That's a really good point. I love that one.
Which one do you think?
I prefer the idea that maths is created because I prefer the idea that all of human anything is false. That
Okay.
we are simply really good at trying to categorize things, which is why we created languages. And then we're good at communicating that, and that is how we've shaped our reality over time. But I like to believe that there is an objective plane, but we will never understand it.
Yeah. For me, intuitively, that's how I see things, that there is an objective plane and we interact with it like we're a substrate and the objective reality is the enzyme, or the other way around. Wait.
Do we catalyze it or does it catalyze us?
Good point. No, I think the objective reality is the enzyme and we are the substrate, and when we interact, there's a catalysis.
Okay.
Yes. But with the ideology points that I was making, I was trying to argue for what you said earlier, in that perception is creation and that maths is
Creation.
Invented.
Yeah.
Created. But for me, intuitively, it's discovered. Yeah.
Okay. I think this is all super related to the exhibition I went to, because both Hilma Klint and Piet Mondrian were abstract artists who kind of started the movement of abstract art, and it was really interesting that they both had a sort of spiritual approach to it, especially Hilma A.F. Klint, who used her art to kind of create a system of like symbols and numbers and color to represent life in a way. And then whereas Mondrian had like this approach to abstraction that is an attempt to represent the most objective of truths through reductionism, essentially, which we also spoke about in our episode on reductionism in art and brain science.
Yeah.
And one quote by him, I think I said the same quotation in the reductionism episode,
Oh, yeah?
but I just really, really like it. And he said, I wish to approach truth as closely as is possible, and therefore I abstract everything until I arrive at the fundamental quality of objects.
That's
and
so interesting.
Yeah, I really love this approach to the use of art as seeking truth by reducing.
Yeah, it also reminds me of how, like, art, you can have such a similar methodology to science. Yeah.
Yeah. And linked to what you said about like the dynamicism, so I forgot exactly what it was.
Structuralism.
That reality exists only in the dynamics between things or their interaction with each other. Well, that firstly links to what we talk about with structure function relationships and the dynamics that link the two. We've spoken about in many episodes. But also what I observed in the exhibition is both artists, they really tried to portray dynamics in an abstract way. So like, I didn't know this before about Mondrian's work. He did like these famous box designs of different primary color squares and rectangles and shapes, which can come across as really simplistic, but actually he saw vertical lines as representing like masculine energy and horizontal lines as representing feminine energy, and the two interacted in this way to create his artworks. And I think that the beauty of the abstraction is that it's not abstracting necessarily matter, but like redefining relationships and dynamics as matter.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. A really cool way to think about it and to perceive it.
And supporting the use of art in understanding reality better.
Yeah, so those were just a couple of my thoughts on reality. And it's a vast topic, so there's a lot to cover. Do let us know what your ideas are on reality and whether we perceive reality or if we create reality. Thank you for listening.
I hope you enjoyed the episode, and please feel free to share the episode and follow us on our Twitter and Instagram at neuroverse_pod. And also check out our website for any resources and submit feedback about our podcast on the Google Form sheet you can find below. Thank you so much for listening.